What got me into this, basically why I wrote a piece in the Irish Times back in August on the ideological echo chamber of the media, was watching the two referendums on abortion and on same-sex marriage, and watching how a particular narrative played out in our media, an overwhelming narrative which basically painted anyone who stood against so-called progressive views as backward and as bigoted and as sort of belonging in another age. And this was a cheap trick which basically media journalists, consciously or unconsciously, used in order to bypass the need to actually engage with people's arguments. Because you know very well that when you depict someone as a bigot, as backward, as belonging in another era, that you are priming people not to take them seriously and not to listen to their views. When we want to think clearly about something, we need to get the perspective of a number of different people. If somebody told you we should abolish the welfare state and made an excellent argument for that position, one of the first things you should do is find a pro-welfare person and hear out their argument, right? You want to balance and hear both sides of the issue. If someone tells you we should leave the European Union, well, you better find someone who has a perspective that says we should stay in the European Union so that you can hear the opposite argument. And this is just common sense. You don't listen to only one perspective when you're forming your views. I would quote here one of my favorites, even though he's a bit heavy-going sometimes in his style. I don't like his prose very much. But John Stuart Mill, who is one of the fathers of liberalism, and I would guess a lot of progressives might look up to him actually as one of their heroes. Here's what he has to say about the need for multiple perspectives when we're forming our opinions. I quote from On Liberty, written in 1859, no less relevant today than it was then. The only way, he says, in which a human being can make some approach to knowing the whole of a subject is by hearing what can be said about it by persons of every variety of opinion and studying all modes in which it can be looked at by every character of mind. No wise man ever acquired his wisdom in any mode but this. Unquote. I could not say this more eloquently than John Stuart Mill. No wise man ever came by his opinions by only consulting one source of opinion, by only consulting one perspective. You need to consult multiple perspectives in order to form a rounded and informed opinion. This is just about rational inquiry. This is about how we form our opinions in general. But I think this approach to rational inquiry, the multi-perspectival approach, is relevant for how we think about a free press in a democratic society. And I hope to show this in my ensuing remarks. The media is the public mind of a democratic society. Basically, the problem with a democratic society, one of its limitations is being such a large-scale society, you cannot possibly include the individual perspectives of every single citizen in public debate. It's simply not possible. We can't have an assembly of all citizens. So what do? We create a public sphere by basically nominating or employing journalists, or journalists maybe even in alternative media rising up through the ranks, who become the voice of the people. This is a minority of the people who nonetheless will try to speak for the people, will try to articulate the perspectives of citizens. And that's how we constitute a public sphere. And so this means that the media has a crucial role in a democratic society. It has the role of being the public mind of a democratic society, you could put it that way. And when we lose a sound media system, we lose our mind. I mean, that's another way of thinking of it. We lose our public mind when the media system is dysfunctional or completely one-sided, because it does not take into account a sufficient breadth of perspectives to make sound decisions, to deliberate in a responsible manner. And if you think about fascism, if you think about Nazism, if you think about communism, one of the features of these political systems is the monopolization of the public sphere by a single perspective. Often that's the perspective of the government, but it doesn't have to be only the perspective of a government. It could be the perspective of a particular class or a particular group. So when you see a monotony in our public sphere, when you see a monologue, alarm bells should go off, because you realize what's happening here is that our public sphere is becoming corrupted. You realize that what's happening here is that important perspectives are being sidelined. The integrity of our public sphere, its sanity, if you will, depends on three fundamental factors. First, it needs to be free. In what sense does it need to be free? It needs to be free in the sense that it's not dominated by big business interests. It needs to be free in the sense that it needs to be able to conduct its business free from arbitrary government control and regulation. Secondly, it needs to be civil. What does that mean? To be civil means to be able to engage with a range of perspectives in a more or less polite and dignified fashion, in a respectful fashion. When our public sphere becomes dominated by tribalism, when we fail to show respect to our adversaries, this is the beginning of the end of a democratic society. This is when we begin to open the door to arbitrary exclusion of groups of people and of the domination of society by particular groups who get the upper hand. We have to learn to live together and respect each other's views. And that's what civility allows us to do. So besides freedom and civility, what else do we need in a functional media system? We need perspectival diversity. We need a media system to reflect a broadly representative spread of opinion. And this is the if you like, the feature of a functional media that I'm going to focus on in the rest of my remarks. The need for philosophically diverse media system. When these three conditions are met, when we have a media that is free from arbitrary government interference, free from arbitrary interference by big business interests, a media that is civil in its conduct, a media that is diverse in its views. When these three conditions are met, a media can fulfill its three of its basic functions, which are first, to hold politicians and other public actors accountable for what they say and do. Second, to assist the public in responsibly forming its opinions. And third, to give a voice to a wide range of citizens in the public sphere, and thereby to help them feel included in the democratic process. But only a diverse media can fulfill these three public functions. Let me explain why. Let's start with the first function here, which is holding public actors accountable. Social commentary, opinion, journalistic opinion, and investigative journalism, and indeed news reporting, cannot be tied too closely to the interests and perspectives of one social sector. Otherwise, it loses its independence. That is because what we find is that certain ideologies will line up with certain interests and certain social groups very often. So let's consider, for example, welfarist ideology. A welfarist ideology that basically, or philosophy if you will, that supports the idea of a very strong system of welfare delivery by the state, obviously favors certain classes in society rather than others. It favors classes that are either unemployed or are perhaps economically less well off, which is fair enough, right? But there are other interests at stake as well. There are a lot of people who also earn a wage, or a lot of people who also have are making a living by going to work on a daily basis. And you have to take into account both perspectives. It's not enough to take into account only the perspective of people who benefit from the welfare system. And so I'm not saying, by the way, that welfare is a bad thing by any means. What I'm saying is that if you only have a pro-welfare ideology, and that's the only ideology you hear in the public sphere, then other concerns and interests that are relevant are often not taken into account. In a similar way, if you only had a free market ideology that said basically that we just sort of, the invisible hand will take care of all our problems, if we just let the companies go at it and compete, society will be just fine. That perspective often can favor the interests of large businesses and can favor the interests of the wealthy. And so it's not enough to only have free market voices in our public sphere. In a similar way, if we only have progressive sort of voices from progressive ideology also often lines up with certain social classes, certain maybe upper middle class, for example, very often can more line up with a progressive ideology. It happens in the United States and maybe to some extent in Ireland. So in order to hold public actors accountable, we need an ideologically diverse media, an independent media that can speak truth to power. Secondly, a second function besides holding public actors accountable is assisting the public in forming their opinions responsibly. The media has an enormous responsibility, and I say this not only politically but culturally, because the media essentially represents on the public stage a process of truth-seeking, right? A process of seeking out what is true, what is right, what is just. And as such, the media is modeling how we ought to think about justice, how we ought to think about facts, how we ought to think about reports and claims. So the media should engage citizens in a lively truth-seeking process. But if the media is an opinion echo chamber in which basically different journalists are congratulating each other on their excellent perspective, then what happens is the media can tend to collapse into a conformist, sloppy, and lazy echo chamber in which people just sort of are unaccountable for what they say, they're unaccountable for their arguments, because their colleagues will slap them on the back when they make a nice progressive argument. Whether it be progressive, you could also imagine a Catholic-dominated media in which pro-Catholic perspectives are given a free pass just because everyone is Catholic. You could imagine that happening. We're not in that situation now, obviously, but it's perfectly conceivable, and I believe it might have happened to some extent in Ireland in the past. And the problem with this echo chamber is that when the media models a kind of navel-gazing, introspective, self-centered way of seeking the truth, which maybe is not even seeking the truth, that actually is infectious, and that can actually permeate other social sectors, because people who are listening to this media, watching the media, how it conveys its arguments, they end up mirroring that process, sometimes unthinkingly imitating that process in their own speech. So when you hear people saying things that you've heard in the media a lot, and they're saying it as if it was their own opinion, they're actually unconsciously mirroring the thought processes and patterns they've been absorbing through the media. And I'm not saying people are necessarily stupid, but the fact is we all are influenced by what we read in the media. It does form the way we think, for better or for worse. And so the media has to be diverse. It has to take into account diverse perspectives in order to in order to model this truth-seeking process. The third function of the media is to give a public voice to citizens. The only way in which this is possible is if the media represents a broad range of public opinion. There is a broad range of public opinion in the country. Let's not pretend that Ireland is, is just a uniform kind of country with one ideological and philosophical perspective. Ireland is a diverse country with many different perspectives: rural, urban, Catholic, atheist, Protestant, Jewish, liberal, progressive, classical liberal, maybe someone who hasn't made up their mind what kind of their perspective is. You have all sorts of perspectives, right? And if the media is not diverse, it cannot give a public voice to citizens. It simply cannot do it. It does not do it. And what happens when that, what is the consequence of that? The consequence of that is it breeds alienation, it breeds resentment, it breeds citizens who cannot identify with the political process. Because they look at the political debate, they look at what's happening in the TV, on the radio stations, on the airwaves, and perhaps sometimes even in the social media to some extent. And they cannot recognize themselves in that process. They cannot recognize their own perspective in that process. And so they basically feel that the political process has been hijacked by views that in no way represent them. Let's get to the Irish media now. Is the Irish media an echo chamber? I mean, you'll probably guess that my opinion is it is an echo chamber. However, I don't want to say it's an echo chamber on every issue or an echo chamber in every single debate. But I do believe, I am convinced of this based on, and I have to admit that I do pay more attention to national media than local media, so I am biased in my own perspective. What I'm saying probably is more relevant for national mainstream media, just to point that out. There are certain perspectives that are absolutely underrepresented in our public media, and those perspectives are in our society, but they're very underrepresented. First, the perspective of serious practicing Catholics. It's absolutely almost shocking to hear the voice of a serious practicing Catholic on national radio who's actually convinced of what they believe. When you hear that, you think, wow, how did this person get into the studio? Did they get in the back door? Did they get in the back door? I don't know. That happened a few times on Marion Finucane. It was extraordinary. At least one of the people in the studio was a Catholic who was convinced that this was actually true, what they believed. Okay, classical libertarian thinking, is not, I don't think, particularly represented in our media system. So perspectives that kind of to do with the free market, to do with the individual liberty, emphasis on individual liberty, those perspectives tend to be sidelined or not very much represented. They are present, but I think they're underrepresented. The perspective of social conservatives. Okay, a lot of people don't like the word conservative, but I mean, I think it's accurate with regard to certain issues. I mean, because you want to conserve a certain form of social order that has been handed down and is traditional, but it's not uncritical conservatism. You're saying we want to conserve this because we think it's good. Now, the perspective of social conservatives is so underrepresented that conservative has become a bad word in this country. To say you're conservative is to say that there's something wrong with you. Then we get to radical left critics of the state, right? We have our mainstream welfarist leftists who sort of basically want a welfare state and perhaps more of it, right? But there are radical left critics of the state who say that the state is actually a dominating force in society, and that welfare system in the way it functions is a dominating force, and who are looking for a way to revitalize civil society from the left. How much of that voice do we hear in our media? I don't think we hear a lot of that. What about rural Ireland? Right, obviously mainstream Irish media is based in Dublin mostly, right? So, I mean, it's understandable they'd have a Dublin-centric perspective. But if I was from the country, which I'm not, I'm from Dublin, but if I was from the country, I would be annoyed, to say the least, by how little the rural perspective, I think, is taken seriously in the media. There's some of the perspectives that I think are underrepresented, and I think corresponding to that, we have a number of issues, concrete issues, in which diverse perspectives are not really present, or at least one perspective is overwhelmingly present to the neglect of others. And so I'll give you just a few examples. Abortion, I think absolutely the case. Religious education, yes, definitely. State involvement in religious schools, definitely. Sex education in the schools, definitely. Family law, yeah, definitely. The welfare state, also not really put in question a lot and how it functions. The European Union, we have a hugely European Union loving media. I haven't made up my mind about whether Ireland should get out of the European Union or not, but I can tell you that that I would like to hear more of the anti-EU voice to inform myself. And immigration, yeah, absolutely. So you don't hear anyone who questions immigration is considered as a racist or as approaching a racist. Okay, so now what does this diversity deficit mean? So if we can agree, as some of us here probably will agree, that there is a diversity deficit in our media, what does it actually mean for Ireland? What does it mean for the functions of media in Ireland? Well, we'll think about the three functions, take them one by one. Opinion formation. Okay, so the media is supposed to help us form our opinion in a responsible manner. It's supposed to model the process through which we arrive at the truth. And what we get instead, in a lot of cases, is a lazy, and what I call lazy liberalism, a lazy one-sided type of liberalism in which other perspectives are just sidelined arbitrarily. Was represented as an abortion case from the very beginning, right? It was framed that way, it was represented that way. The reports clearly showed that that was a matter of medical malmanagement. It was just, her case was completely mismanaged, and the infections were not detected on time. The case was not about abortion, but the narrative overwhelmingly was that it was about abortion, right? Let's just say that a strong case can be made that it wasn't about abortion. And so how did that narrative, why was it so dominating in the pages of our newspapers and in our radio and TV? Why did it dominate the public sphere? Well, obviously it dominated because there weren't, the media was too one-sided and it didn't represent the other perspective. Okay, just look at the certain assumptions that are made in the media that are rarely questioned, and that the journalists can often get away with because they're not being questioned. Here's one of them. Social conservatives are out of step with the times. Well, that's a pretty question-begging argument, right? Because everyone wants certain things from the past to be preserved. Everyone wants that. Liberals, conservatives, progressives. But if you don't like someone's perspective, then of course they're out of step with the times, right? But I could turn around and say to a progressive or a liberal, you're out of step with the times. We need to change. You know, I think we need to really bring in the voice of civil society. I think the state is too powerful, right? We've had that for long enough. You're out of step with the times. All right, well, it's not enough to say you're out of step with the times. You have to make an argument about what's good and bad, right? So secularization equals social progress. Another absolute pervasive assumption in our media, secularization equals social progress, right? Well, even if you're not Catholic, Christian, or believer, there's a strong case to be made that religious faith has an important function in a society in helping to give people a framework of values and a sense of orientation in their life and helping to build community, right? So that kind of case is not frequently made in our media. Another example of one-sided opinion in the media, immigration. Anyone who questions the immigration process or wants to limit it is immediately a candidate for being a racist. All of this one-sided opinion formation basically leads to bad reasoning, unsound reasoning. And this is not just some academic, philosophical kind of concern. I wish we could have a better reasoning process. It's about the decisions that come out of that reasoning process. It's about the outcomes. If you have a bad reasoning process, an unsound reasoning process, a one-sided reasoning process, look at the outcomes you're going to get. You're going to get completely uninformed outcomes that are not informed by the relevant factors. So one tragic case is the Rotherham case in England, right? A town in England where for over 16 years, Pakistani gangs, predominantly Pakistani gangs, were abusing minors sexually, and they abused over 1,200 victims over that period. And local councillors, as the official reports showed, that came out in 2015, local councillors put the hush-hush on this process and didn't really play it up and didn't investigate it thoroughly. And why did they not? Because they were afraid they'd be accused of being racist. That's why they didn't look into these questions. So political correctness and one-sided opinion formation is really dangerous. It's really dangerous, and it can give you very, very bad policy outcomes and tragic policy outcomes. Now look at the second issue, right, which is public accountability, the second function, holding public actors accountable. Well, the fact of the matter is that many journalists are anti-Catholic. And I think if you look at the tone, sometimes it's more subtle, sometimes it's more in your face. But many journalists in Ireland are anti-Catholic in their perspective, or at the very least are highly sceptical towards the church and anything it might stand for. And so what you get is, you get selective scrutiny. If there's a problem in the Catholic Church, I guarantee you, and if it comes to light somewhere, somehow, journalists will be, investigative journalists will probably be on top of that and will be looking into it closely. If there's a problem with Planned Parenthood, if there's a problem with an abortion provider, if there's a problem with a transgender doctor, I would like to see how many journalists are clamoring to do investigative journalism and to expose those issues. And I would say that the experience shows us that journalists are human beings with a perspective and with interests, and they will, including myself and everyone here, we will tend to investigate things that bother us. That's just human nature. And I'm not saying that's necessarily always a bad thing. But if you have an echo chamber where we all more or less on the one side, then certain problems don't get investigated, they don't get researched. Okay, the third function is giving a voice to citizens. This is very important. If you don't give a voice to citizens in the public sphere, this is undemocratic, first of all, because essentially policy outcomes, legislative outcomes, political outcomes are not informed by the interests and perspectives of the citizens in the country, right? So that's inherently undemocratic, and it minimizes the participation of citizens, the relevance of their voice. And I'm not a pure Democrat, but I think people's voices have to be taken into account. But there's a second issue if you don't give a voice to citizens, and that is you actually delegitimate the political process. The political process becomes, in many citizens, as I said before, in many citizens' eyes, it becomes hijacked by certain groups and certain interests, and they feel left out. They feel their voices are not being heard. And they will look on that process with suspicion. They will look at its outcomes with suspicion. A lot of people look at the abortion outcome with great suspicion, and they think it's not really, it never followed the proper process of a public debate. Is that what progressives want? Is that what liberals want? Do they want the political establishment and the political institutions to be delegitimized? Because we're heading that direction. We're heading that direction. Peter Casey went from 2% in the polls a little over a week before the vote to 23+% in the polls. That's nearly 1 in 4 voters voted for Peter Casey. This is a guy who basically just sort of came out and said he had some problems with travellers. Right, that's kind of how I would think of him. And like, I don't agree with everything he said, and I think he put some of his points in a fairly awkward way. Let's just say in an unfortunate way, I would say, really. However, it's very telling that he got 1 in 4 votes. This is very indicative that citizens, he tapped into something, into a frustration, I think, in citizens that they weren't being heard. So just to finish up, to say where to from here, three suggestions. One is media monitoring. Can we have maybe some kind of institute that monitors the content of media so that we have hard evidence of what we're talking about and it's not just impressionistic? Second, can we diagnose the deficit in conservative, liberal, classical liberal, libertarian, etc. Christian journalists? Why are they not going into journalism? Are they being turned off by something?